Welcome back, everybody. Day 2 of our countertop project. We've already got our sealer coat on most of this countertop, and then over here we also have some of our TRUETONE stain. It's been drying for 24 hours with good airflow since it's all been applied. Everything is very nice and dry. There's no grip, there's no anything else associated with it. It's nice and dry. You can buff out any major imperfections, so if you had something land in your finish that's very obvious, take care of that now. But in general, we don't really want to do any sanding. We're just going to make sure our surface is clean. Again, we've had air movement, so we've been kicking up dust or blowing dust around. So we're going to wipe everything down with a little bit of paint thinner or mineral spirits first, and then we're going to continue on to using one of our finished products. I've divided this countertop into 3 sections, and we're going to look at a few different things today. The most popular options would be our original finishes, our Waterlox products, which are low odor, very low VOC. They're going to mimic these original finishes very closely in terms of the final performance and look. And then we have our urethane finishes, which I'll demonstrate a little bit more. They're great for commercial settings just because they have that urethane plasticness to it. They hold up a little bit better to harsher cleaning and more aggressive improper cleaning. And they're also going to have a slightly different color associated with them. So we'll take a look at that as well on a few of these areas. For our solvent-based finishes, we're going to look at our regular solvent-based applicators. So we have our natural bristle brush for our oil-based products. Landfill pad works great. You can also even use these synthetic pads as well. A brush is great for cutting in edges or fine work, but you could also use these larger pads for doing the whole countertop pretty quickly with minimal effort. For the water-based finishes, you want to make sure you get something that's built for water-based. I tend not to like the water-based brushes as much. The foam brushes are fine. Again, these pads, these synthetic pads, as long as they state they're good for water-based finishes, work very well for larger projects. This would be perfect for a countertop project. We also sell and recommend these T-bar covers. So you would come with a metal bar that attaches at the end of like a broom handle, and this slides over. It's similar to a roller cover. However, it doesn't roll. You can cut that up in small sections to do smaller projects, but this is going to be your ideal product for doing a full floor. Maybe not great for a countertop, but those are kind of your options there. One thing you'll probably notice is that none of these products are rollers. We do not recommend rollers for anything that we do. They tend to create a lot of bubbles. Our products are not designed for use with rollers, so that's the biggest thing to avoid at this point. So I'm going to clean all this table off and we're going to get started. But again, first things first, we're going to wipe everything down with a little paint thinner and let that dry for a few minutes. Alright, so we've wiped our whole surface down with a little bit of odorless mineral spirits. That's fine for wiping down between coats. Paint thinner is usually labeled as made with mineral spirits. Those are both fine options to wipe down your surface. After everything's nice and dry, it's not going to harm the finish, and it's going to pick up any of that stubborn dust. We're going to start with the Waterlox satin finish in this middle section here. Just because I think the middle is going to be a little bit more difficult, we'll start with that one. And I'm also going to show you why it's important to seal your wood first before using these water-based products. We have an unfinished section up here in the corner, and we'll look at what that does. It'll be particularly noticeable on something that high in tannins like oak. Other woods would be walnut, cherry to some extent as well. But tannins are usually the problem. We definitely want to make sure our applicator is nice and clean. You can usually take a piece of tape or a lint roller and roll it across to make sure you have no loose fuzzes, and then we're pretty much ready to go. So with these finishes, you usually want to gently turn them over a few times just to kind of stir them up. We don't want to shake them too aggressively. They're obviously not in a container that's easy for stirring, but a gentle stir is really kind of all you need. Typically you want to let it rest for a little while so you get rid of any bubbles, but it's going to be, typically shake it up, get your surface prepared, let it sit 5-10 minutes, and then we're ready to go. So with the water-based finishes, we typically just pour a small puddle. You'll notice it looks like it's got a chocolate milk type look to it. We'll take our pad in there, and then the first step is kind of wet out the surface. So don't worry too much about go with the grain at this point or getting everything nice and level, we got to start by getting everything kind of wetted out first. So taking extra care on the edges. This is a water-based product and it is therefore water thin, so it tends to kind of float around on you. Be careful around edges, you can easily splash it over the sides. That's pretty common. But as this pad gets more wet, it'll be a little easier to push around. The water base is nice because you do have a pretty good idea of where you've coated. It's pretty obvious. If you miss a spot, you won't see that chocolatey milk type look over the surface. And again, it always helps to have proper lighting when you do it and get down nice and low to examine the edge. I'm just going to hit this unsealed edge as well. And then again, particularly with that water base, make sure you have a rag handy because it is water thin, so you're going to want to watch those edges for runs and drips and wipe those off immediately. So now we got everything nice and wet, you can kind of see the haze over the whole section here. We're just going to start at one end, basically no pressure at all. Drag the applicator from one end to the other. With this wider applicator, we can do it all in 2 passes. We have this nice kind of bluish brown chocolate milk film over the surface. You can still see some bubbles. Again, most of that will work its way out, and we're just going to let it sit from here. Let your applicator dry out before you dispose of it. And again, since we're pulling to one edge, make sure you wipe that edge off. While your applicator is still a little bit wet, you can lightly go over those sides and the edges just to get some product down there to make sure you're catching any runs or drips on the underside as well. So that's as easy as it is for the water-based finish. We're going to keep the airflow to a minimum to keep the dust down. We're going to let this water evaporate. And you'll see in about 15 to 30 minutes, you're going to have a nice, clear finish as all that water evaporates and that chocolatey haziness disappears. So that's as simple as that for the H2O products. 2 quick things I forgot to mention about the water-based products is immediately after application, you can take your dirty applicator and just rinse it with soap and water. Let it dry and you can use it again. Or they also usually sell refills for these that you can just toss this in and get a new one. The other thing to do is if you are buying one of these pads, synthetic pad type applicators, make sure you read the packaging. They'll typically say that it's good for solvent-based, water-based, both, latexes, epoxies, whatever it may be. You want to make sure you find one that's good for water-based. Ideally, it's good for water and solvent. That way it won't fall apart on you when you're using it or applying and you won't have little fibers everywhere. So 2 quick things to note. This one says, I believe, suitable for all paint types. And there's more information on the back about what that specifically means. Alright, welcome back everybody. It's been about 10 minutes since we put on our water base and you can already see that milkiness is starting to fade. So we're going to head and move on to this closer section to me and we're going to put on our original satin finish, product number 6044. So first and most importantly, again, we want to stir this product well. It should look a little bit like a bit of a golden color when you first open the lid. If it's been sitting for a while, it'll probably look dark brown. Using a tongue compressor or a paint stirrer, we're just going to gently stir. We're not trying to go super aggressive. We don't want to introduce a lot of bubbles into the can. But we're going to give this a nice good stir, and you should see some of the clarity decrease in the can. That's that flattening agent that makes this a satin finish. So we're going to make sure we get that nice and stirred up from the bottom of the can. When you pull your stirring stick out, you shouldn't have big clumps on the bottom where you were pushing around goop. If that's the case, your product may be pretty old. It may have settled out, so it may require some more aggressive stirring, or you may need to go with a new can. First we'll clean up our stir stick here. And then what I have here, we're going to use this 5.5 inch lamb's wool pad. It's going to do great for countertops. We also have a paint tray with just a paint liner in it, a movable plastic liner. That way we're not ruining a paint tray for that. We just toss that when we're done, once it's dry, of course. Then we'll pour some of this into the tray. Probably a little too much, but we wipe our can nice and clean, try and get what we can out of the rim, and we're going to put the lid right back on. So we're not exposing this to a lot of air when it doesn't need to be. So you see you'll have kind of a cloudy golden brown liquid. That's your satin finish. We'll take our paint pad, we get it nice and wet, wring out some of the excess, and then we're ready to start putting on our wet coat. Again, it's a little bit more difficult with this second coat because you've already done most of that color change. So you really want to make sure you get down nice and low, make sure you don't have any mist spots. But these lamb wool pads are excellent at putting down a nice wet coat without much effort. I'm not pushing, I'm not squeezing, it's very few brush strokes. But first things first, we make sure we get everything nice and wet. Make sure you get those edges and get nice and low and look close. And then typically again, as we did with the water base, start at one end, lightly just drag that pad from one end to the other to kind of line everything up and get rid of most of those bubbles. Again, sorry about that, everybody. I received a phone call in the middle of filming there, so it stopped the recording. But we just made some final passes down the edge. We do still have a nice wet pad here, so we can do a very light coat on those edges just to get it nice and sealed. Again, we don't need a big thick coat on the edges. You don't really have standing water there, so it's really not that critical to get a lot of product on the edges. We still want to check for runs or drips. Now, as I mentioned with the water-based pad, make sure this is clean before you start. Do it with a lint roller, or you can even toss it in the dryer with the plastic handle on it. It's a little louder, so you may just want to stick to the tape. If you look real close, you may still see some hairs here and there. Now's the time to kind of deal with those. For instance, I see one right here. You can usually slide it out with a gloved hand, of course, and then we like to do a full run just to blend that back in. Again, get down nice and low, look nice and close, and make sure you didn't get any mist spots or look for any obvious imperfections. We don't want to pour unused finish back in the can. That's been exposed to oxygen and may start drying. You may put debris or bits back into your can. It may cause problems in your later finish coats. So typically you want to just let this air dry, and then you can dispose of it properly, or put it into a waste can of some sort and let that all, discard that all properly with your local regulations. So that is our original satin finish. You have a nice glossy wet coat applied. Okay, we have our original satin finish on this near side, our Waterlox satin. On the middle area, you can see, again, this is almost all completely gone. It's been about 10 minutes since we did the original satin. And last but not least, we're going to apply our satin urethane. Excellent product for commercial uses. It's excellent for countertops. It's still an oil-based product, so it's still going to bring out the richness, as we'll see, but it can also be used as a top coat over our other sealers, our universal tone sealer, our stains, or it can be used on its own. You'll see a little bit what those differences are and how it affects the final color, but it's truly crystal clear, so it's great on things like, very popular for maple, where you don't want as much of that amber hue, or you can even use it on white oak and things like that, and we'll take a closer look at that. These two products, the Waterlox and the satin, we want a full 24 hours between coats. The urethane is going to dry a little bit faster, typically 6 to 8 hours. It's typically fully dry and ready to recoat. If you get to it before 12 hours, you can recoat. If you go longer than 12 hours, you definitely want to do a light sanding before you put your second coat on. We'll revisit that tomorrow when we go do our finish coats. All of these products will be one coat of that sealer that we've already done. So we have our stain, our original sealer and finish, and the universal tone sealer, followed by 2 coats of finish. The only asterisk to that is if you're doing a very soft wood and you're sticking with our traditional sealer and finish product, you'd want to do at least 2 coats of that due to that wood being extra absorbent. The universal stone sealer is high and solid, so it tends to even that out and take care of it. So I'm just going to work right out of this can because it's mostly empty. We've opened it, we've stirred it just like the original satin finish, and then I'm going to use a good old-fashioned China bristle brush to apply it. We'll do a couple sections here to show what it does over the color. And it is still oil-based, so you still have some of that richness. You'll still get a little bit of the yellow, but this would be very similar to just wiping your surface down with a little paint thinner or mineral spirits. We'll see basically kind of the same color change there. So that's a good preview for that. And we'll cover that in another video. So not overworking the brush and not overdoing it. Again, kind of do these sections. It's a little hard to work in the middle of a surface. You can't brush off the edge. But lay down a nice wet coat. Kind of align everything with the grain. Again, always get down low to make sure you got every surface covered. When everything's slightly drier, do your edges. And of course, always watch for runs or drips. I'm going to coat this front edge as well, and we'll compare it to our other oil solvent-based finishes, our resin-modified tongue oils, which is the original, and then the water-based version of that, which is the H2O-Lox. And we'll kind of look and see how that colors different. So this section of the countertop has no sealer on it. It's just raw wood, so it's much lighter and less golden than the other surfaces. And that's due to we don't have any of that tongue oil in here. We have different resins, and there's no linseed oil or anything else that's going to add to that yellow or amber tone. It's still oil modified, so it's still very flexible. It still gives great richness. It's not going to give you that kind of dead, dried out look that some water-based finishes do. So it still has really good beauty, so it really brings out that wood. Not quite to the same extent that the original products do, but it still looks pretty nice. And it really tends to show off that wood. The other big difference with the urethanes is that they're a little bit more truly a surface finish. So you're going to get a little bit more build with these. It's going to look a little bit more finished. But even on particularly open grained woods like this oak, you'll still see some of that character and that texture shine through. So again, we just brushed on a wet coat. We started at one end, we brushed to the other to kind of smooth everything out. I'm going to put the lid back on. We'll clean our brush with some paint thinner or mineral spirits a few times, make sure it's nice and clean. And we can use it again another day. So that is applying the urethane, and as you may be already able to tell, you are getting some rich golden hues with it, but it's not going to be quite the same as our resin modified tongue oil finish products, the original and the H2O-Lox. Immediate follow-up after we've gotten all 3 of our satin finishes on. Again, we have the original satin finish, the H2O-Lox satin, and then our urethane satin here. Again, this is H2O-Lox with no sealer underneath. You can tell this one's already looking pretty dry. That's to be expected. We put water over kind of raw wood. It looks a little rough, and you'll actually even see some darkening of that wood. We'll look at that a little closer later. You'll see what putting water on a high tannin wood like oak, and then we use metallic dryers in our products, so they tend to all interact, and it creates some drying problems. So here in the middle we have our H2O-Lox. Pretty much all that milky white is almost gone. And we see kind of that nice golden color. Same with that original. Again, there's kind of very little difference between these two. Some things to point out is here's our initial tape line where we didn't seal yesterday. It's less evident on the solvent-based side. Again, you kind of have solvent on solvent. So it's all basically the same thing being applied. We're here in the middle where we didn't have that sealer. It's kind of obvious where the sealer didn't go down. Again, we have that water and raw wood interaction going on. You'll probably see some discoloration, and the way it's going to affect that wood is going to be a little bit different. So also to note here, we kind of have a very little, almost totally negligible, I can't even really tell the difference except for I know it's there. This is our Universal Tung Oil Sealer side, and this is our original sealer and finish side. And they pretty much look identical. I would say the original sealer side is a little rougher looking due to that first coat going down a little bit more rough, and the Universal Tung Oil Sealer side seems to be a little smoother. You can see with the oil-based products, you still see that grain definition, still soaking into some of that softwood and still building up even though we have it partially sealed. We'll step down here to the stain colors. It's hard to tell when everything's still wet, but we're starting to see some drying. You will notice a slight more amber with our solvent-based products, or our resin-modified tung oil products, the Waterlox and the original, compared to our solvent-based urethane product on the satin finish. You can see it a little bit more clearly there in the unstained area. There's a slight difference in amber hue. Another good thing to point out is here's a raw wood section where we have one coat of the satin finish over the raw wood, and right to the right of it we have two coats of that original product, and you see there's slightly more dark, slightly more amber. So that's a good indication that if you aren't quite dark enough on the first coat, you may get there at that second. Again, here's our raw wood urethane. You're seeing less of that gold in that wood, but it's still nice and rich compared to unfinished. Welcome back, everybody. It's day 2 on our countertop finishing project. We've got our countertop behind us with our first coat of finish over our sealer coats and our stain. So the last part of this video, we're going to talk about doing our last remaining finish, which is the TRUETONE Buff In Tung Oil finish, product number 7011. So this one, I apologize, I may be out of the shot here, but we're going to focus on just this small area. This is going to apply just the same way we applied the stain. It's just our clear coat. This is designed to seal in this color, so we're not rubbing it off or interacting with the stain color. It'll also fully saturate that wood to give us a waterproof surface. So again, all we really need are some gloves. We have our rag, and then our soft buffing pad. This is actually just the other half of the sponge that I used to apply the color 24 hours ago. So we've cleaned the surface. It's vacuum swept, wiped down a little bit, painted our mineral spirits. Because we are buffing this product in, it does not need to be as super clean as the other wet applied finishes like the urethane, the Waterlox, and the original products, because we're not really putting a wet coating on here, so dust is less of a concern. So this is a totally clear product. It does not need to be shook, stirred, mixed, anything. Basically, we are just going to pour a little bit onto the wood. That's probably too much. But just as with our Universal Tung Oil Sealer that we started with yesterday and our color yesterday, we pour a little funnel. We kind of wet out the pad and the surface. And we'll just add another little drop here just to make sure we got a fair amount of product on. And again, this is designed to seal in the color and saturate the wood surface. So what happens is the wood is going to absorb the oil and the resin, and tends to look pretty good immediately afterwards. The TRUETONE line of products doesn't really have any dryers in it, so it really kind of works its way down into the wood over that first 24 hours. So usually when you come back the next day, you'll see areas that look a little more starved, and that's just that wood's absorbing that product a little bit deeper as it goes. That's why we do the 2 coats of finish on top of the color, but you are going to use less product each time. So we got a nice wet layer here. Again, get down low to make sure you got everything coated. And if you notice, we did pull a slight amount of color off. It's really hard to tell. but there is some residual color on that surface that we're reactivating with some additional solvent in the finish, and it's going to pull a little bit of color off. A good tip there is, if you don't want to lose any color, wait longer and get better air movement. The longer you wait and the better air movement you have, the more dried and set in that color is going to be. So I got everything wet. I'm just going to flip this pad over and just do a quick wipe to get most of the excess off. So we're not wasting too much sitting on the surface. And I definitely put too much product on here. We got plenty of product. Wipe down our edges. And then we're just going to let this finish sit for 5, 10, 15 minutes. We'll come back in with our clean rag and we'll wipe off the excess. So we've just finished applying our TRUETONE buff-in tung oil finish over this end of the countertop here. While we're letting that set up, you can kind of see how wet it looks right now. It looks pretty uneven, it looks pretty streaky. So we're going to follow that up with the most important part, which is wiping off all the excess. While we're letting for that to soak in, we'll take a look at all of our other finishes here, how they're doing a few hours later. Again, this is our original side here on the left, our H2O locks in the middle. Here's some H2O locks on raw wood. And then we have our urethane along this front edge, as well as some of it over our colors to see the difference. One thing you'll note is the H2O locks is already kind of getting to that nice satin look, whereas the original is staying a bit shiny. This has been about 3 hours since those were applied, but you really don't see any difference other than that. The way that the flattener works is when the solvent leaves, the film shrinks. It exposes that flattening agent to give you the lower glosses. And the water tends to leave a bit quicker and shrink that film a bit faster. Well, that's why it's getting to that lower gloss a little faster. You can still see we had a kind of a thick spot of urethane there. So it's looking kind of puddled and shiny, but we'll let that dry. We won't be able to get to it today, so we'll recoat that tomorrow after our light sand. And then here, again, we'll look at our colors. We got urethane on the left, our original, and H2O locks on the right. And it's subtle, but with that one coat, you do see a bit more of that amber tone with the original products compared to the urethane. That's a pretty good comparison there between the urethane satin and the H2O lock satin. Definitely have a bit more amber there. This is impossible to see with a camera. If you remember, we did a small section of the white oak that didn't have any sealer on it with the H2O locks. So this is already getting pretty dry. I can touch it. It's got a bit of a tack to it. Again, it's been a couple hours, whereas this is extremely tacky still. And again, that's the tannins in that oak that's affecting the dryers and not letting them do their job. So that's the biggest reason for using the North Tongue sealer before the H2O locks. It also tends to minimize any fibers that may stick up. Again, you're putting water on the raw wood, so it tends to swell it. You get fibers, you get kind of more of a rough coating, and then you get that loss of dry. That's why we seal the product up. Okay, now it's been a substantial amount of time. We'll take our clean rag and put our glove on. And we're just going to come back and wipe off the excess TRUETONE finish. You can see that gloss disappear as we wipe here. We'll do an initial wipe. And you can see we're not really pushing the color around. We're not bleeding into these unstained areas. So you're not really dissolving the color and moving it, but you can tell there's a slight gray to this rag. So we are pulling just a tiny bit of color off. And again, best way to get good amount of color to stay is allow it to dry longer and have better airflow. So we wiped off the excess, we'll get down low, and basically as you can see there's basically zero sheen to that surface whatsoever, and that's what we're looking for. Again, since there's no real film, you don't have to worry too much about dust. You can kickstart your ventilation at this point, and we're pretty much dry to the touch. You don't want to walk on this with sock feet. Obviously you'll pull some oil. I wouldn't walk on it with dirty shoes either. So if you needed to get across it, you could do so, do it quickly and let it breathe when you can, but it's basically dry. Okay, so it's the end of day 2 here. We have our white oak IKEA countertop with our first coat of finish on. We sealed most of this. We got our color, our original sealer finish, and our universal tongue sealer in these areas of the wood. And then we have our 4 different interior finishes applied. That would be the original on this section, the Waterlox in this middle area here. We have our satin urethane on this end section here. And then we have our TRUETONE buff-in tongue finish on the very end over here. All 4 of those options are food safe and non-toxic when cured. So they do great for countertops. Let them cure thoroughly. And this is only coat number 1 of our finishing step. And we're going to do a second coat to fully seal everything and get it nice and finished and ready for use. So we'll wait 24 hours on the original, the Waterlox, and the TRUETONE. The urethane you can recoat again in as little as 6 to 8 hours. I typically want to say recoat within 8 to 12 just to be on the safe side. If you do go more than 12, which is totally fine, do a light sanding before recoating, and we'll cover that tomorrow.